Welcome to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the curator of collections.
This time we're joined by artist Anahita Harding.
Anahita has been a curating visibility fellow at the Food Museum in Stowe Market. The Food Museum is an amazing museum, so you should all go and visit the Food Museum. And Anahita is an amazingly talented and informative voice in relation to disability and disability advocacy. Her practice and performance work is extraordinary. And the work that she's been doing with the Food Museum has been centred on challenges around food and interpreting food-related collections with disability in mind. So today's conversation is all about disability history, and also about accessibility more broadly. So the challenges that heritage sites and museums face in relation to opening them up and making them inclusive and welcoming spaces to everyone.
It was a great conversation, and it also followed a tour of the galleries that Anahita gave this morning, which was brilliant as well. And unusually for us, we actually had a museum object out on the table this time as well, which we talk about later in the podcast.
Yeah, so we'll be looking forward to introducing you all to Len's Leg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, enjoy the episode. Welcome, Anahita, to Absolute Units. It's brilliant to have you with us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So Anahita, you're joining us here at the museum on a day when we've been going around the galleries, doing a gallery tour for a small group of members of the public. And we've been picking up on themes related to disability and rural life and to food. Mm. And you've recently been at the Food Museum on a curating visibility fellowship. Could you explain to us a little bit about what that curating visibility fellowship was and how it connects to stories of food and heritage?
Yeah, so the Curating Visibility Fellowship was arranged by Screen South, and the idea was to place different disabled and neurodivergent people into different museums around England. So while I was at the Food Museum, there were also two other fellows, Kat and Carl. So Kat was at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, and Carl was at Dover Museum. So the idea was to look at disability histories in museum collections, because a lot of the time disability narratives aren't included or displayed. And this was something we wanted to uncover. But at the same time, many museums also don't hire disabled people in the first place. So the fellowships gave us the opportunity to work in museums, get to know members of staff, and get to know how museums work and how the collection system works. So, yeah.
As I understand it, the Curating Visibility programme is picking up on some work that Screen South have been developing over a number of years, and we were lucky enough to benefit from one of the early projects in that whole series of schemes, which was called Curating for Change. Now, Curating for Change brought with it opportunities for museums to host either a longer placement or a shorter trainee placement. We had a trainee called Verity Shillabeer who came to us for a couple of months, and she worked on trying to unearth and identify and find ways to tell stories about disability that related to these collections at the Museum of English Rural Life. And I think the challenges that you experienced are quite similar to the challenges that Verity experienced. And these were sort of rooted in the fact that we have all these amazing collections, and they speak to a very great diversity of experience in the past in relation to food and farming and lots of different parts of rural life. Within that, there must be the stories of disabled people from the past, but it's very hard to find them in the documentation. Mm. So how did you respond to that at the Food Museum? And maybe I can come back and tell you a little bit about how Verity responded here.
Yeah, sure. So at the Food Museum, I began by looking through their database. So there they use eHive as their collections database. I really struggled to find objects that were directly related to disability, although I did find two. So one was a book of sermons written for a deaf parishioner, and another one was a sculpture by Redvers Taylor, and it was titled The Crippled Figure. Part of the work I did was with co-producers. They were local disabled people in Stowmarket, and I put together 8 workshops where we cooked together and also talked about our difficulties accessing food and cooking. And from those discussions, we found out we were having similar issues accessing care and accessing help when cooking food. So I thought I would look at the collection again and look at items which might not explicitly say they're disability objects, and that lots of people could have used in the early 20th century. But because there would have been disabled people around using these objects, I would use them in the intervention I put together. So what I then did was I collected these tools. So there was a potato masher and a bread knife, for example, and I matched these with modern objects which have explicitly been adapted for disabled people. And we put those on display for an exhibition at the end of my placement.
Amazing. Yeah, can I just ask, how were you able to find the objects within the catalogue, the disability history rated objects?
So the way I found the 2 objects related to disability was, I don't know if this is a good method, but I looked through kind of outdated terminology, which we wouldn't really use today. So one of the terms was crippled, and that's how I came across the sculpture, because it was titled Crippled Figure. But I typed in, I mean, we would use the word deaf today, but I typed in as many keywords that I could think of. So deaf parishioner came up, and that's how I found the Book of Sermons. But I did really struggle to find objects on eHive. And then going back to the sculpture, I later found out that it was called the Crippled Figure, not by Redvers Taylor himself, but by a volunteer who had decided that's what the sculpture represented. And so I'm glad someone had told me that, because otherwise I could have based a whole intervention around it when actually it might have had nothing to do with disability.
Mm. Yeah, because it reminds me of a conversation we recently had with another researcher on the podcast, Tim Jerome, who looks into queer histories. And I think he had a similar experience of trying to explore the catalogue for, in his case, like queer-related histories, but not having either objects weren't labelled properly, or the risk that they were labelled using offensive, outdated terminology.
Mm.
So the work that Tim did really brings us quite neatly to the project that we have running at the moment, which Tim actually worked on before he went off to go and do the PhD that he's talking about in those podcasts you refer to, Joe. And that project is called Further Afield. And Further Afield is designed to tackle, in some ways, the challenge we're talking about, which is the underrepresentation of particular narratives and experiences related to rural collections. The lens it does that through is through taking protected characteristics as a starting point. It's a bit of a clunky method, but essentially we're looking at 3 protected characteristics. We're looking at racial identity, we're looking at disability, and we're looking at LGBTQ plus histories. And we're trying to work with community groups to better access and explore those aspects, recognizing that the countryside isn't just a white, heteronormative and able-bodied space. But the challenge is the same. It's essentially you try and interpret the collections based on the documentation you have, and the documentation is often quite partial. It's quite limited. It's thin. Even if we know somewhere there might be disabled histories lurking in amongst these 30,000 objects, where do you start to look? We have actually got, as part of that project, a team of volunteers who've been working through our historic documentation, a little bit like typing into the catalogue and trying to find things. They're sort of reading through the stuff that fed into our online database and that sort of text, but there's still very little there. So I think there's something about reading between the lines and making that leap to assume that disabled histories are there even if we can't find them, and trying to find ways to bring those to light. So the way that Verity did that was to look online, because she didn't have the time to work with communities as you've been doing, and to find disabled experiences about the countryside and then hook those onto collections that we have already. you were also acquiring new collections for the museum, and you're also working with communities. How did that conversation with communities impact on the way in which those conversations unfolded and the work that you presented in the exhibitions played out?
So the local people who I interacted with all had different disabilities, and one thing I wanted to stress to them was that I, as a disabled woman, do not represent all disabled people, and that together we would co-produce the exhibition. And I really wanted to hear about their thoughts on food and the collection, and to also direct the way the exhibition was going and the intervention. So from listening to them and from sharing our experiences together, that was when I realised how much cuts to care were affecting everyone. And that's why I wanted to create an intervention which linked the past to the present and the progress, or perhaps lack of progress, that has been made. The aesthetic differences between modern tools and older tools was a discussion that we had together. In terms of adding to the collection, I don't know if this is for a fact, so I'll be careful. I'm not sure if they have acquired it, but in terms of adding to the collection, there were 2 liquid level indicators. So those are, it's a tool you can use where you put it on the side of a mug, and if a visually impaired person is filling a mug with hot water, the liquid level indicator will make a beeping sound so that the person doesn't overfill their mug and scald themselves or burn themselves. So that was a really important tool that we all kind of explored together. Other tools were items which could be used for peeling vegetables and mainly potatoes. So starchy foods came up quite a lot. Then we looked at adapted knives and easy grip knives and compared them to bread knives from the past, from the Food Museum collection. And funnily enough, the easy grip knives that we used weren't really accessible for the group, which we all found quite, well, in a way it was quite funny, but it was also quite frustrating because we were trying to do cooking workshops as well together. But it did make us think, did the people who designed this have first-hand experience of being disabled and being unable to use knives, or did they just, I don't know, I don't really know the research they did to come up with this knife, but it was just very hard to use. And then we compared it to a bread knife that was from the early 20th century and has a wooden handle with an ear of corn design carved into it, and it's really beautiful, but the carving makes it easier to hold. So it's quite an interesting contrast seeing this kind of green and grey right-angled knife that's hard to use, and then this older, quite beautiful wooden knife that's quite easy to hold. So yeah, these contrasts are something we had a lot of discussions about.
Strikes me as really interesting that almost over-designed things that are relatively recent, that have maybe not been designed with disabled people involved in discussing their functionality, end up looking sometimes a bit bland, and yet something in the past that's been created in a very bespoke way, potentially for an individual to then use in their own individual circumstances and placement, ends up being something quite attractive. I think it's really important that things are both functional and attractive, and also designed for individuals rather than trying to come up with a blanket solution. And I think that's something that comes through in galleries as well. The challenge that we've had here at the museum, you begin to cater more for one set of audiences, perhaps audiences who have particular needs over lighting, and that impacts on other audiences who perhaps have particular needs over lighting that are different. Different visual impairments responding differently, or people with neurodivergent needs that need lower levels of lighting, or it's very hard to find a sort of universal solution in any of these challenges. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it does. So lighting was one thing we looked at together as a group. And in Abbots Hall, it was the dining room that we used as the space for the exhibition/intervention. In there, the lighting level was good for some of the co-producers and not very good for others. But with Catherine, the curator at the Food Museum, we spent a lot of time trying to get the lighting just right so that we could highlight the objects and highlight the artwork so that they're visible to visitors, but also not casting loads of massive shadows everywhere in the room. So it was quite tricky to get that just right and to not kind of end up shining lights into people's eyes as they walk into the space. That was something I really learned, how tricky lighting can be in museum spaces. Because I hadn't realised that before.
Yeah, dazzle the audience, smoke and mirrors approach to disguising your curatorial practice.
Yeah.
We've all tried that. It doesn't necessarily resolve the challenges. But just a little explainer that Abbots Hall is one of the historic buildings in the site of the Food Museum, which was at one point the Museum of East Anglian Life.
Meal.
Yeah. So meal to our MERL.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one that never came into being was MELT, the Museum of English Life and Traditions, which was the brainchild of a folk practitioner and curator called Thomas Bagshaw. Anyway, I digress, but
that's for another episode.
Yeah,
that's for now.
There's a whole deep dive.
The story of Thomas
MELT.
Bagshaw. Yeah.
We have one of his wagons here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that's another time.
Anyway, let's not go too far down because we're doing what we said we wouldn't.
Yeah, I'll talk no more of Thomas Bagshaw. So a quick explainer that the Food Museum it's an open air site, has some historic buildings. Abbots Hall is one of those historic buildings, and I think there are probably challenges around historic buildings that add yet further to the layers of challenge around making museums and heritage spaces accessible.
Yeah, there are, and I guess we're doing a podcast right now, so the listeners can't see, but I'm a wheelchair user and I'm unable to walk. So that was a challenge getting around the Food Museum site. And there is a golf buggy which you can use to go around, but for me, I wasn't able to access it. So I did do a bit of research into wheelchair accessible golf buggies. And I think that would be good for the museum to have in the future for wheelchair users to visit the whole site. But yeah, access for museums in general is such a massive issue. And I know there are different museums who have done things like put together access advisory panels in order to improve their accessibility. And I do think that's a really good idea because it's good to speak to a group of experts who have lived experience rather than maybe just one person or none. And it's good to at least have a try in making a museum site accessible, because I think a lot of the time, maybe not having the budget for it can be a reason given for a museum to not be accessible to disabled people. But I think there are ways around it, such as maybe training members of staff or training volunteers to be patient and supportive for disabled visitors.
I guess, I'm just thinking again about the easy grip knives. I suppose it's making sure that when you are designing objects for people with specific needs, that you make sure it's designed in such a way that it is easy for those users. And the way you find that out is by consulting with them rather than sort of projecting onto them and then getting it really wrong. We've chatted about design a few times on the podcast so far, but mostly in terms of designing and sort of improving vast agricultural estates. But what we haven't really thought about is designing space for people. And that seems like a really central part of these kinds of conversations, is making sure you're asking people about what they need and building space for them.
We've mostly talked actually about making spaces inaccessible to people, haven't we? We've talked about processes of enclosure and fencing and the construction of ha-has at the front of big country houses to try and block out people and stop livestock and wildlife from moving freely around the world. But I guess this is more of a conversation on the opposite end of that spectrum and making spaces more accessible rather than less accessible. A lot of the conversations that we have, certainly in heritage sites around disability, centre on it in opposition to able-bodiedness. They often medicalise conversations around disability. What I think is really amazing about your work, Anahita, is that it's about empowering people. It's about a positive narrative as much as about focusing on the negative or focusing on challenges. Is that deliberate, or is that something that's emerged in the conversations with the community participants?
I think part of my work is around educating non-disabled people just on the fact that we exist as disabled people, which might sound really silly, but a lot of the time disabled people are hidden at home, or maybe they're not hidden at home, but they're hiding their disability because they feel like they would be unwelcome if they disclosed it. So I think raising awareness around bodily difference is something I try to do in my work, and just acknowledging that there may be disabled people who might work at a slightly different pace or in a slightly different way, and just having that patience and space for disabled people in the museum sector, as staff as well as being visitors.
Just on the adjustments made for people with disability at work, especially, for Anahita and Ollie, do we have any examples in our collections of how that's happening in the countryside today or in the past? Or is that something that we're particularly, that we have much about?
Well, I guess a really nice connection there might be one of our partners through Further Afield is an organisation called Inclusive Farm, founded by a blind farmer, Mike Duxbury. And Mike wanted to farm, but he found that, buying an existing farm or going to work on an existing farm, it wasn't accessible to him. So he started from scratch and he designed himself a farm. And if you visit Mike at the farm, he and his partner, Ness, will take you around. And it's amazing how that space has been adapted so that someone who has no vision can navigate a farm space. Those of you who've been on a farm will realise how difficult that is. These are not accessible spaces. But he's created surfaces. Often the textures on fencing and gates are different as you move into different sections of the farm. The flooring can be subtly different, so that it's about being able to identify where you are in the space at any given time. Little adaptations like that are amazingly empowering. And Mike's work, along with Ness, with Inclusive Farm, is all about trying to show people that it's possible for you to go into farming and into food production as a disabled person. These are spaces that can be adapted like any other workplace to make them accessible to a wider range of potential users and workers, in exactly the same way that Curating for Change is trying to have that conversation, and Curating Visibility are trying to have that conversation for museums and heritage spaces. We can make changes, and we should make changes, and we shouldn't be sort of stopping, patting ourselves on the back with where we've got to and just assuming that everything is fine, because we can always do a little bit more. I guess the other aspect of what you're talking about, Joe, would be around changing technologies that are making things accessible anyway. And a good example of that, which Verity picked up on in her Curating for Change traineeship, was around dairying. So dairying as a workplace would not be traditionally a particularly accessible workplace to people with mobility challenges. It's obviously quite a physical and engaged experience. But as dairying practice becomes more automated, say, for example, in a robotic dairy environment where cattle choose when to be milked, they walk into those milking stations themselves, the robots fit the teacups to the udder based on knowing that individual animal because they're wearing a Bluetooth device of some sort. So it's all automated technology. It would be perfectly possible for people with mobility challenges to be working and supporting those kinds of dairy environments far more significantly than they would have done 50, 100 years ago.
So just going back a bit, I'm wondering if we could talk more about the theme of medicalisation, especially because in a rare treat for us, we actually have a museum object on the table in front of recording, which is Len's leg. Ollie, could you explain what Len's leg is and its significance?
So Len's leg is a prosthetic leg which was acquired relatively recently by the museum. So it was only accessioned into the collections this year. I first learned about Len's leg a few years ago on social media when the farmer Phil Latham posted details of it, and Farmers Weekly journalist Johan Tasker had posted details of an article he'd written about it. So Phil had taken what actually is his grandfather's prosthetic leg to a National Farmers Union local meeting and used it as a jumping off point for a conversation around farm safety. His grandfather, Len, had lost his leg in a farm accident related to heavy horses. So there's a sort of, big reminder there that working with large animals and indeed machines on farms can be extremely dangerous. It remains one of the most dangerous of occupations in the country. But using this leg as a jumping off point in that meeting then resulted in the leg becoming the sort of centerpiece of a farm safety campaign. And related to Len's leg, if you look on social media now, you may find lots of examples of sharing stories about both accidents and deaths on farms. So it's become a kind of iconic object for telling and sharing those stories. And Phil and his father very kindly donated the prosthetic limb to the collection so that we can carry on talking about and focusing on those stories. But I guess in relation to medicalisation, what this does is it takes a very particular angle on disability. And there's often in rural life and heritage conversations the tendency to only talk about disability as being centred on farm accidents and the resultant experiences of people who've experienced farm accidents. Is that something that came through at the Food Museum, or was it more of a focus on other kinds of approaches to disability, Anahita?
I didn't actually find anything about accidents. I mean, there were similar objects in their collection, but I didn't see anything about accidents, no.
So that question of medicalisation, the conversations you were having were really a counterpoint to that. They're about not so much necessarily about the medical experience of disability or through that lens, and not about collecting things that relate back to medical treatments and framings of disability, but more about experience out there in the world that's unconnected to the medical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was just to show disability stories in the first place, because I couldn't find any at all. So I couldn't find any from a medical perspective. I mean, that from the sermon book, I guess it's kind of a charitable act to create this book of sermons for the deaf parishioner. But
what this makes me wonder is we've obviously got Len's leg sitting in front of us, and it's one part of a wider set of disability stories and narratives that we could be telling much more frequently here at the museum. Mm-hmm. And at the other end of that would be the ideas about heavy horses and machinery that I talked about.
Yeah.
At the moment, we're not really talking about either of those. So it's a perfect case in point of what you're saying about an absence of reference to disability. But what's interesting for this case is that we had lots of the technologies, and we got the technologies related to heavy horses, but we didn't have something that really represented in a grounded material and physical way the experience of someone who we know for certain had disabilities caused by farm work. So there's always a bit of absence. There's a bit of the story missing, whatever way you look at it. And I think in lots of cases, the story in its entirety isn't there. And I think this is something that we really need to work more substantially on in order to bring it to the fore.
I think in a way it also serves as a reminder that anyone can become disabled. And I think that needs to be remembered when talking about disability, because I think a lot of non-disabled people maybe don't want to think about it. And that could be a factor in why disability narratives aren't shown or told in museums or in other spaces also. So, yeah, I think... I don't know. I just think it's a really great object, and it does really remind me of the splints I used to wear when I was younger. When I was able to walk, it was really uncomfortable and not fun to walk in at all. So yeah, I can only imagine how Len found it.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, our conservator looked at it when it first arrived. When I brought it down from Phil, Len's grandson, and he wasn't sure that it had ever really been used. So either it's possibly a limb that was produced for Len towards the end of his life, when perhaps he wasn't using these things quite as much, or possibly it was really uncomfortable and he never used it. It reminds me actually of, we have some pair of women's Land Army boots from the Second World War, standard issue women's Land Army boots that say WLA on the sole. If they'd been used a lot, they wouldn't say WLA on the sole because it's a leather sole and it would have worn off. But they were apparently so profoundly uncomfortable that people didn't wear the standard issue boots. They wore other boots instead. So there's a kind of interesting thing in there, isn't there?
One thing as well, Ollie, could you just quickly audio describe Len's leg? Because then we can include that as well.
So the leg itself is comprised of a lower leg and an upper leg. The upper leg is... open at one end, so that the Len's thigh would have been able to sit into a sort of soft leather cradle. On the outside, it's a sort of dark brown leather, and there are leather straps and strings at the front, so like a lace, a shoelace, to tie up at the front and tighten it onto the thigh. The lower portion is, I think, a combination of wood and a sort of plastic coating of some sort, or a painted coating, so it's certainly white clean. The lower portion looks very medical. It looks like a sort of medical solution to a disability challenge. The upper portion actually looks like a sort of carefully crafted leather object. It looks much more aesthetically pleasing. So there's something quite interesting going on in there. You've got that combination of the aesthetically pleasing and the slightly more medicalized. And I think this picks up on some of the things you've been talking to us about, Anahita, about design of objects and aids. I think this question of aesthetics and functionality is a key one.
Yeah, I mean, the top half reminds me of a carefully crafted boot. And when I'm not an amputee, but when I've worn similar splints, which aren't quite the same, but they were quite ugly, to be honest, and they were red and they didn't have laces like Len's leg does. They just had kind of Velcro straps that went across. So yeah, it is funny seeing how that kind of aesthetic quality has, well, in my opinion, has declined a bit. I guess because they're maybe mass manufactured, whereas this looks like, especially the top half, looks like it was handcrafted quite carefully.
It's a nice object in that respect, in that it draws together, in some ways, two different sides of the MERL collections. On the one hand, stories about food and farming and the context within which Len was working when he had his accident. But on the other hand, stories about craft and making. And this has been very carefully made and picks up on that kind of, the care of hand making, I think, is something that's really important. In your own artistic practice, you've got, on the one hand, I think, performative practice, and then you've got work that's more about collage. It's not necessarily connected to food and farming, but you're here and we want you to tell us about it because it does connect really powerfully to questions and challenges around disability. Are you happy to explain a little bit about your wider artistic practice and maybe give us some examples?
Yeah, so I'm also a performance artist. So A lot of my work looks at disability and disability activism. One of my pieces was called Steps, and I used my arms to pull myself up 311 steps in the monument to the Great Fire of London. So for that piece, I was looking at fire evacuation plans for disabled people, because the current procedure is that if you are physically disabled in particular, you wait in a refuge area if you're on the top floor of a building, and then you wait for the fire brigade to come while everyone else has evacuated. And I've been in similar situations in the past, and it hasn't been fun. It's been quite horrible. So yeah, I wanted to raise awareness around that issue, and I also wanted to raise awareness around CLADAG, who are Cladding Action Group, and the work they do on raising awareness around unsafe cladding and unsafe evacuation plans for disabled people. And other pieces I've done have looked at inaccessible public transport, and general attitudes towards disabled people, which tend to be quite negative. Apart from when the Paralympics is on, then they kind of switch to being a bit inspiration porn.
Too little or too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So either really patronising or just really negative and kind of demonising. So it never ends up kind of just seeing disabled people as people. And I guess that's kind of what I tried to do at the Food Museum, to show that, yes, some of these objects would have been everyday objects, and they would have been used by disabled people as well as non-disabled people.
I think your description of climbing up the 400, was it 400 steps of the Tower of London?
311.
311. Yeah. I was going to do that bit again, but I mean, wow. But it does, it so clearly shows that the kind of personal experience in comparison to this massive tragedy. Very thought-provoking.
I think what you were saying there about either there almost being too little or too much provision may also resonate a little bit with interpretation in museums, that if we took all of the stories in the Museum of English Rural Life and made them all about disabled experience in the countryside, it would be slightly misleading, and it wouldn't necessarily resonate with people, and maybe they'd find that a little off-putting. But also at the same time, we haven't got a sufficient number of stories out there where disability is part of the story. I think part of that trick is also about showing that people are more than just their disability, and talking about disability just as a normal part of a wider framing of narratives around people. Do you think there's a way that we can do that avoids a tokenism? We don't want to have the token two people stories in the galleries that just talk to disability, but nor do we not want them there at all. It's a kind of balancing act, isn't it?
I guess in a way this might sound like the opposite, but bear with me. I think having an intersectional approach is really good, because, as you said, disability is not the only part of a disabled person's life, and there will be other things about them which also need to be represented in museums. So I think by being intersectional, then you can cover loads of bases at once, and you can relate to more visitors and also more members of staff, and make sure that you're kind of telling accurate stories throughout the museum.
Yeah, and I think showing people with this, like you're saying, showing people with disability who exist in other parts of our collection, not just because of the disability, but because of the role they have. I'm mindful of, is it Fred Misen, Ollie, the strawcraft artist who made the Festival of Britain strawcrafts of the lion and the unicorn?
Yeah, and we hold some of his pieces, but smaller pieces from the Festival of Britain, which he made for the displays at the Festival of Britain as well.
He lost an eye, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, so in photos of Fred Misen, In fact, the photos are of him posing with the lion and the unicorn. These were two amazingly tall sculptures. I think one 7 foot tall, one 8 foot tall, which were at the front of the Lion and the Unicorn Pavilion at the Festival of Britain. They don't survive, sadly, because they went to Selfridges, I think, or one of the department stores in London after the exhibition was taken out, and they were used in a window display, and then they were placed in the basement where they were reputedly eaten by rodents.
Oh, no.
I don't think you can necessarily take it from this that there are rodents.
It's a very rural end.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's any truth in that, but in these photos of him posing beside these rather enormous sculptures, he is wearing an eye patch. And anyone who has seen strawcraft, maybe corn dollies or other forms of sort of woven straw or stalks close up will understand that actually it's quite difficult to do that with two functioning eyes. To do it with only one eye is extraordinary, I think.
Yeah. And I guess that's the way we can frame these narratives, right? It's not just talking about the disability, it's talking about disability within the work and the wider significance.
Yeah. And the challenges of doing things just in everyday life with a disability that perhaps, you've incorporated that into your daily practice in life. So my grandfather lost sight in one eye as a consequence of a horse riding accident. He came off a horse and I think he landed on a barbed wire fence. So really bad end to that eye. Later in life, he still drove. He found ways to work around that challenge and still worked actively on a farm until well past retirement, really.
So a really strange thing has happened. That is the end of the episode, but the recording cut out before we could say goodbye to Anahita. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to Anahita for joining us. If you want to find out more about Anahita's work, you can learn more at anahitaharding.com. We'll put the link in the show notes. Absolute Units is hosted by me, Joe Vaughan, and our co-host, Dr. Ollie Douglas. The podcast is made possible through Museums Partnership Reading, our Arts Council funded partnership with Reading Museum. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. And if you've enjoyed the pod, please leave us reviews wherever you're listening. It massively, massively helps. Thank you so much.